Well, for now, final presentation on this topic. It's been an incredible pleasure to bring forth our theses over the last several weeks. And today, as it's been suggested, we hope to deliver the goods on seeing Paul's leadership in a new light. We chose this title, The Power of Paul's Leadership, to engage and resist in the time that remains. The engagement is to think about how Paul leads from a place of knowledge of a horizon. At the same time, he also resists certain temptations or certain ways of seeing what that leadership might mean going into that place. So we want to just suggest that it's a bit of a dance here for Paul. We have some guiding questions, of course. First of all, we want to start with, how does Paul see himself as a leader in the time that remains? You remember from our last talk that we brought forth a text from Giorgio Agamben, who suggests that one way to see Paul powerfully is to think about the horizons that he works within. And we want to continue to use that frame today. We also want to explore what happens while Paul is a leader in Corinth, to again situate this work very much within the context, times, and milieu of this particular place in history. We're presenting today our 4 cases of Paul's leadership, and these 4 cases have been developed. There are other cases we have in mind, but for the purposes of today's talk, we're going to focus on dealing with factions or division, setting boundaries, drafting policies, and recentering on core values. So again, these 4 cases are not meant to be exhaustive. They're rather meant to be suggestive of some directions and how to uncover and unpack what Paul has to offer us moderns in the field of leadership.
Brent, did you define those cases only in an inductive way, looking at 1 Corinthians, or did you use theories of leadership to encroach? It's obvious it's in the text of 1 Corinthians, but did you do more than simply abstract from the letter, or did you use leadership theory?
Well, I think the best way to think of it is, as we unfold the case, you'll learn more about the methodology. Okay. But of course, the methodological question remains for those of us who are methodological always. I don't know that I want to make any strong claims for us regarding method yet, but let us tell the story. And as we tell that story, let's go back to your question and circle back. Is this inductive, deductive coding? Are we thinking about this in terms of parallelisms or analogies? We're getting there. So let us get there and we'll share more. It's a good point, though. How do we situate method? For now, we'll just remain agnostic, paradoxically. So Paul in the time that remains. This is section 1 of our talk. And again, we are looking at this in terms of what we're calling provisional time, a time between Christ's resurrection and his return. There's no specific date, but something is imminent, something is on its way, and Paul is moved by that perception, experience, and what we might say inhabited sense of being. We also know that there is implications. There are implications for the community's perception of time. And Paul is constantly working not only with his own perceptions, but the community itself. So to refresh everyone, we want to make sure that we go back over the project for Paul, and this idea that while he doesn't have a timeline, obviously, in the way that we as folks in business or any kind of organization might have one, he does have a sense that there is an ordering or a unfolding or some kind of way in which this is all progressing. And so we start with the idea that everything has changed since the time of Christ crucified and the resurrection. We date this at circa 32-33 CE. And certainly for Paul, this is a recognition of an event that has occurred in history. There is time now to start assembling the congregants. And of course, for Paul, this means working deeply with the non-Jews or the Greeks, who he sees as those who he is bringing to Israel. So while there are other leaders like James or Peter who've been working with the Jewish congregations and assemblies. Paul is for the Greeks. He is clearly, and we will demonstrate, concerned about making preparations now in his time for upright living and keeping one's promise to what we call Torah light. And we'll again describe that in this talk, but we did signal it a bit last time. In the time that actually remains, one should live, as Angaben puts it, as if or as not, in the ways that we previously did. Kletos is a marker for calling. Paul certainly sees himself as a leader with a calling, and we would be remiss not to point that out. We'll describe more what we mean by both his apostleship and his calling. But I just want to take a moment to actually read from Angaben, who I have the English translation here, gives us an idea about what this distinction between as if and as not means. So for Paul, quoting here directly, the redemption of what has been is the place of an exegesis for the messianic. This place does not involve a point of view from which we could see a world in which redemption had taken place. The coming of the Messiah means that all things, even the subjects who contemplate it, are caught up in the as not, called and revoked at one and the same time. No subject could watch it or act as if at any given point. The messianic vocation dislocates and, above all, nullifies the entire subject. Of course, the subject in this case would be Paul. This is the meaning of Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, quote, "It is no longer I that live, but the Messiah living in me," end quote. He lives in him precisely as the no longer I, that dead body of sin we bear with ourselves, which is given life through the Spirit in the Messiah, Romans 8. So this as if, as not distinction, we expect to explore more in a paper that we're writing. But for now, we just want to go back to, for Paul, this messianic project, or should we say at this point, this almost inhabited project, is not about as if or possible worlds or some sort of thought experiment. It in fact is rooted in the recognition in Paul's leadership that Christ will return and that it can be expected within a generation. Now I put down here circa 50-90 CE, not that there's anything in Paul to directly suggest those dates, but rather to remember that Paul's own work and his letters are dated roughly between 50 and 60 AD. That puts him in somewhat of a contemporaneous position to imagine his generation is not much longer than 90. We can argue about the margins, but the point is it's going to occur somewhere by the end of the first century. The bringer of Torah light, that's Paul, to the Gentiles is really the project of joining with Israel. Paul, his innovation as a leader in what we could call a set of Jewish movements that are occurring in real time in the first century, of which Paul is one leader, his innovation is to acknowledge that no one has a duty of circumcision in the Gentile world. That is, non-Jews who he's working with do not have that duty, nor do they have a duty of dietary restriction, what we might call kosher. They also do not have any specific duties with regards to celebrating all traditional Jewish festivals. The main two being the most important, but the third one I think is worth mentioning. There's not an obligation on behalf of the Greek in Corinth to go to whatever Jewish festivals are available or in the area. But, and here's the critical point for Paul, we still have ethical duties in the time that remains. That is, we might think about Paul's project as reminding, enforcing, and gently sometimes, and other times harshly, reminding people that we ought to be turning away from pagan idols and offerings, and 1 Corinthians talks about this. We need to be upholding appropriate sexual ethics and conduct. This is, again, contra porneia. We'll discuss that a bit more in terms of setting boundaries. We also have an ethical duty to engage in table fellowship and communal meals with care and respect. So while we may not go to Jewish tables and have Jewish festival activities, to the extent we have them in Corinth as Christ-believing Gentiles, we must engage in ways that are careful and respectful. And Paul talks about that in this letter, and we'll uncover it more in terms of, again, identifying policies and practices. And again, maybe we can say the last but not least here, to remain resolute in love and avoid contention. And this letter clearly deals with the problems of faction and division that have been reported to Paul. And he is concerned that people are pursuing contention rather than what he sees as the unifying force, which is love. As we said last time, Paul is leading for proximity towards Israel. So our contention, consistent with many of those who in the last 20 to 30 years have repositioned Paul as in fact someone who has come to fulfill the work of the new kingdom. Paul is working with Gentile communities to bring them towards Israel. He is called to form and instruct Christ's followers in Corinth. This is, again, in some sense, his revelation, his idea of what he is to do. But we notice that in that work, and we talked about it last time, this means that for Greeks, for Corinthians, we have turned away from our ancestral religious practices. The practices that were rooted, let's say, in our domus, the local or family gods that we worshiped, we've turned away from those. We now worship the God of Israel through his son. And again, this is a core conviction for Paul, one that he doesn't shirk from. Jews do not consider us to be an elected part of Israel. So there is a sense of anxiety, perhaps, and awareness among Gentiles, particularly in Corinth, but we also see this in other letters, the so-called Judaizers. That discourse seems to be about, we're not really taken seriously by those who are sort of the core elected, and we ought to think about what it means to become a Jew. So this is a problem that Paul's aware of. And also that for many of the Greeks who would have engaged Paul's work and his mission, they're very aware that more and more they're being perceived as to some degree antisocial and without love and care and respect for their patron gods of their own city. And again, this is a posture that puts them in a difficult spot. We talked about this, and I remember that Cloud had made some comments as well, that this posture is difficult to maintain. But as we say in today's theme, Paul is up to the leadership challenge. We'd like to say a little bit more about Paul the Apostle. And this way we can think of him as the leader of the Gentiles that we are familiar with. In 1 Corinthians, first chapter and verse, we get a powerful statement that actually reappears in many letters, but here let's go ahead and give it its due. So Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ, Jesus, by the will of God. Now again, we remember that Paul is dictating orally these letters to a scribe. The person is actually writing, we expect, Paul's words. And so we can take seriously that Paul starts this letter with a proclamation. He doesn't say, I, Paul. He puts it in sort of an objective form. Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God. And we point out two things. One, the meaning for his leadership of the word apostle cannot be underplayed or left to the side as just a convenience. The one who was sent is sent, we know in Paul's mind and theology, by God himself, herself, itself. God is actually the one who is driving the decision-making around who will be sent in due time to do the work that needs to be done. So Paul, again, sees himself in this objective manner as a leader. This isn't something that he's volunteered for. He didn't engage in some introspection. He didn't do a workshop over the weekend. He didn't pick up a book to think about how to be a better leader. Paul sees himself clearly as someone who was appointed, not necessarily anointed, but sent by the will of God. This will contrast, of course, with other conceptions of modern leadership. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we find Paul again making the point that it's not so much about the subjectivity or the subject, who is Apollos, who was Paul. We'll say more about those folks in a minute. But the key point for Paul is that the Lord assigned to each of us to be servants. And so while he can claim his leadership as a founder by saying, I planted, and he can even acknowledge another leader who watered, God gave the growth. And so only God is the one who eventually or actually produces the effects. The most we can say about a leader is that they're a leader who is serving in some capacity through a calling to provide their own gifts and skills to bring forward this Corinthian congregation. But it's interesting, again, how Paul positions his own leadership, even in relation to others. He also notes that like a skilled master builder, and here again, now he claims his own subjective stamp, I laid a foundation, and someone else, all the other leaders and co-workers in Corinth, are building upon it. But we should be careful, because even when he says, like a master builder, I laid the foundation, he's not confused about who the potter is or who the person is that is in some sense directing this work. But he does claim that he is laying foundations. Paul also goes to the problem of, again, what is it that we are here to do, but what has been done as well? So in a way, what Paul does is he notes that the proof is in the pudding. You all are here because I came to lay a foundation. And as he communicates with the congregation as a leader of it, he mentions that in fact, they are already full in some sense of the promise. They are his crown accomplishment. But again, for whom? For Christ. So in some strange way, the leader is on the one hand establishing, but he's also recognizing the establishment of something that has occurred. And that in fact is proof, in this case to the Lord, that actually the work is good. Chapter 15, verses 9 through 10, Paul comes forward with a very important idea of, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. There's a credible sense of serenity, one could say, and perhaps for some arrogance, but in others, a kind of almost Buddhist recognition that Paul knows that God has given him the tools, the skills, the abilities he has, and he is what he is. He can't be any more or less than what he is. But that grace that he's been given has not been put to waste. It's not been given in vain. And he notes that on the contrary, I work harder than any of them. Now, here again, this sounds almost like him trying to outbid the other leaders, which we'll talk about in a minute. But really, then he backs off. Though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. And one of the interesting things in the leadership literature is that it's very hard to see when somebody does something, who is moving the action, or maybe more importantly, who deserves the credit, or even whether or not we can show a certain degree of humility when success occurs. It's not to say that the modern leadership literature doesn't have moments of that recognition, but that it's not quite as laid out as it is for Paul. He's claiming and not claiming. He's a vessel, and other times he's an agent. But I think we can say in general, he comes back to this idea that the one who is leading must lead. And in some sense, we can say he's taking almost a no apologies, no excuses, no way out approach to leadership. It's not like he has a big choice here. It's not like he can walk away and wash his hands of the mishigas and the crazy that's going on in Corinth. Paul is what he is, and that is a founder, a master builder. But he's also a leader of this precious congregation. And he does feel compelled to lead. which is interesting because you could ask the question, do all leaders or do most leaders or do many leaders today in different organizational forms feel compelled to lead? And if they do, by what kind of claim would they demonstrate that? In some ways, the power of Paul's apostleship can be thought of as a study in calling, passion, and grace. To lead while being led, it includes a passion for leadership that inhabits, possesses, and animates from within, covering both body and spirit. And it's brought about by the conviction of being called by God to act against the odds. So one of the themes we see in Corinthians, an early theme that we didn't decide to put into a case, but we do think is a major strand, is this notion of perseverance or carrying water, as we might translate it more close to the text in Greek. Paul has no problem carrying water. He has no problem persevering. He understands that trial and tribulation are necessary in the time that remains to his own mission and purpose. And so these pieces of the puzzle fall into place for him and give him, you might say, a certain kind of confidence. But they also, I think, show a certain degree of recognition that one does lead against the odds in any real work, and that part of persevering will be understanding God's role in attempting to put not only you to the test, but those around you who are working towards this thing we might call Torah light.
Let's talk briefly about the origin of this passion, the spark that fired Paul. From what we get in the letters, he had the mystical experience at some point, which is never completely described. It's more through allusions and hints that we get to know what was the content of that mystical experience. So one of the best passages to see what he found through this mystical experience, again, which could be a process more than a sudden moment, is found in Galatians, letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verse 20, which we display on the screen. So it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. If you look at this, you find, when later in the early 20th century, Albert Schweitzer, who's well known for all sorts of things as a musician, as also a Nobel Prize piece, wrote two important books in biblical studies. The first one was published in 1906 about the historical Jesus. And the second one, which cover is here on the screen, is about the mystic, this Apostle Paulus. So what Schweitzer came up with is that, for Protestant theologians of his time, usually Paul was summarized with the phrase justification by faith. That was, for many theologians, many people, what captured what was Paul's main ideas. And Schweitzer challenged this by saying that no, justification by faith is actually mentioned only twice in two letters. The rest of the collection never mentions this, but there's a phrase that returns all the time in Paul's letters. And it's so short and we get so used to it that we don't pay attention anymore. The phrase is in Christ. It's used countless times in Paul's letters. And for Schweitzer, it is really the deriving idea of Paul's mysticism that he wants to communicate to people, so that the members of the groups that are Christ followers are now part of Christ. They have come to inhabit Christ, which is conceived as a corporal personality. So it's an incarnate living in community. If we can go to the next slide, something that we mentioned last week. What is Paul's contention about these Greeks who joined the movement of Christ followers is now that they can be associated with Israel. Once they are part of Christ, and Christ is conceived to be the offspring of Abraham, these people can enter the elected, the chosen nation of Israel by being part of this corporal personality. Now let's fast forward until 1995 and see what someone does with this idea of being part of the body of Christ. So Dale Martin, who now teaches at Yale University, but at that time in 1995 was teaching at Duke University, wrote a groundbreaking book about the Corinthian correspondence, which title is The Corinthian Body. So there are many great insights in that book, but let me focus on just a few of them. Is what he sees Paul doing in the Corinthian correspondence is the building of the body of Christ. But also, since it's a body, the body is susceptible to be polluted, to be invaded by infection. So the body is, the community is seen as a body which should all work together, but also which is sometimes threatened by pollution. And what Paul does to prevent this pollution is to uphold the imperatives from Torah. That is mostly the purity code of Leviticus. This body should try to remain pure and to deal also with threats of impurity, of pollution. So this will be helpful as we look at 3 of the test cases, which are really about addressing the threat of the pollution of the body. And this concept is in a way very alien to us, but in other ways, it's also very close to us when you see sometimes communities that feel threatened and have mechanism to deal with the threats and by expelling someone from the group. Okay, let's move on and back to you, Brent.
Okay, this might be a natural place to pause. I know sometimes there's queries and interest, and I would not want to shut anybody off from that. So why don't we just take a quick moment to ask if there's any questions so far before we continue on. But it looks like we're good. Okay, so now we pivot to fast forward again, because part of the dance that we're doing is both historical, comparative, and of course, to some extent, hermeneutic. We are constantly trying to figure out how do we make sense of Paul today, and on the other hand, how would Paul make sense of us? And we have a privileged position on the first question because we're actually here. But we do notice that today's conception of leadership and leaders may have similarities and may have differences to Paul's own notions of what he was up to and what he was doing. We're going to take a look at what we're going to call the standard model. And of course, that already suggests a contention because I'm sure there are many models of leadership. We've done a bit of a survey on the books that were recommended by different folks who work in different programs in both the secular and religious contexts. And one of the things we notice is this book in particular seemed to intersect quite a few of the recommendations that we got. So we've spent quite a bit of time trying to make sense of this, what we might say in quotes, Bible of leadership. We noticed that it's a very popular book, and it turns out there are a lot of sort of metrics you could use to benchmark how popular it is. It's out in the 6th edition. It's the one that we're using. And it was number 73 in business management, according to Amazon. It was 92 in terms of personal success in business, and it was number 104 in business leadership. As impressively, it's been translated into over 20 languages. So not unlike the actual Hebrew and other Bibles, it's gone into production around the world. There are webinars, conferences, and professional development and consultation aspects of this gospel and the way that it's shared across time and place with different peoples. And of course, in this particular case, it does cost money, and it does require people to pay if they want to get specific consultation. It's interesting to note that it's not only a book, but it's in a sense also a business with its own corporate mission, with its own vision of what it means to lead those who are leaders. But we would note that it's also for those who have not yet attained their leadership potential. So it's not clear whether someone like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos would read such a book. They might. But it is clear that a lot of people who are aspiring to be leaders across all parts of the sectors of any economy could pick up this book. In that sense, it's sort of a study in potentiality, because I think we should be clear, again, it's not only those who have actualized the leadership challenge that's of interest, but it's really kind of a how-to for those who have not yet reached their full potential. We start with a definition because it's always good to let the text speak for itself. The leadership challenge is about how leaders mobilize others to want to get extraordinary things done in organizations. It's about the practices leaders use to transform values into actions, visions into realities, obstacles into innovations, separateness into solidarity, and risks into rewards. It's about the leadership that makes a positive difference in the workplace and creates the climate in which people turn challenging opportunities into remarkable successes. This is coming from the foreword, or should I say the introduction. It's an amazing set of claims. And in some sense, it has its own feeling of a gospel of secular proportions. It reminds me of some of the work that Jacob Taubes did on political theologies, borrowing from Carl Schmitt's concepts, where you take essentially what are religious concepts and you find ways to secularize them, but underneath them, there is an uncovered sense that there's something more going on here than just a rational, secular, scientific discourse. So when I hear things like separateness into solidarity, or visions into realities, you get this sense that something very profound is occurring and could occur. In the standard model of leadership, the leadership challenge requires core practices. So in that sense, it reminds us of, as JF has reminded me many times, the Ignatius spiritual exercises, the notion that one can engage in exercise practice and habit formation. In this particular book, it's thought that there are at least 5 core practices. They are model the way, inspire a shared vision, challenge the process, enable others to act, and encourage the heart. And in some ways, just what we call in terms of face validity, or just a prima facie view of this, there do seem to be parallels with Paul and Paul's particular form of leadership in Corinth. So it's a promising potential. One of the things we wanted to do is just give you a flavor. If you took, for example, one of the core practices, inspire a shared vision, there are usually 2 or 3 features that go with any practice. In this case, one has to envision the future by imagining exciting and ennobling possibilities And as importantly, they must enlist others in a common vision by appealing to shared aspirations. And we see in First Corinthians these moves going on. And in some sense, Paul is practicing what this book preaches. One of the sorts of stories that are told in this book are what we might say kind of these attribution quotes that are built on some kind of a case study. Now, here's an interesting example of the methodology isn't quite known, but basically we take it on face value that a series of interviews took place. And then from those interviews, we get sort of these vignettes. So En Femme, a corporate team leader, and I'm assuming that's a pseudonym, noted when he was engaged with the challenge of inspiring a shared vision that he was uncomfortable with the nature of his team and the way the team was going and the direction it was going with a particular project. And so these are direct quotes out of the book. On knew that something had happened, which suggests maybe not a mystical experience, but certainly some kind of a psychological breakthrough. He discerned that the team needed direction. Discern is an interesting word. I was thinking about, I haven't been in contact with that word until I really started working with Jean-Francois in the theology world, because I noticed discernment's a critical part. So it's a word that can be used in secular spaces, but it just, to me, caught me as sort of an interesting thing. He knew something had happened. He discerned that the team needed direction. And he felt that the other leader, and this is what's interesting again with Paul in comparison, hadn't been very effective. He needed to address the team's low morale while articulating a clear vision for the future. So far, this is starting to make some sense. What's interesting, though, is when we go beyond On, which is kind of the point of many of these books, we notice that On is just exemplifying with a particular experience on a particular project in a particular situation, a more universal set of claims. Exemplary leaders, we're told, are forward-looking. And this is a quality constituents clearly expect of their leaders. So again, if we were thinking about whether Paul is an exemplary leader from the point of view of the leadership challenge, we might ask, to what extent do the constituents in Corinth see him as forward-looking? They envision the future and gaze across the horizon. Now, this is certainly a good place for Paul to fit into this narrative as constructed and through modern eyes. He clearly gazes across the horizon, and he even has a sense of eschatological time. So that's going for him. They imagine that extraordinary feats are possible and that something noble can emerge from the ordinary. And at first brush, it may seem like, well, there's nothing in Paul's mission from his own point of view that is merely ordinary. He knows that, in fact, it's extraordinary. But if you dig a little deeper, Paul is quite clear about being abased and also living in circumstances that would appear even suboptimal, and that sometimes the dailiness of life can help us forget what, in fact, the bigger claims and mission of life is. So this seems reasonable, that Paul might also think that in the ordinary, there are noble things. And maybe that goes back to his policies and practices regarding communal meals. And they develop an ideal and unique image of the future for the common good. And this is clearly a move that Paul makes. So inspiring a shared vision would seem to be so far something that Paul could ascribe to and sign on for. Now, the standard model of leadership in terms of its core practices not only says that you should inspire a shared vision, but that in order to do that, you have to have a sense of the role of time. And here, these are actually chapter subheadings from pages 100 to 104, in which leaders are called to reflect on their past, or your past in this case, because this book is speaking to us as a future and potential leader. So reflect on your past, attend to the present, and prospect the future. So, whatever the merits or demerits are of this particular view of time and one's place and the time that remains on whatever project one is engaged in, you can clearly see that the authors want us to think about past, present, and future as markers for what leaders are capable of discerning and intuiting, and perhaps even learning how to do effectively in order to build this so-called shared vision. Now, here comes a really interesting part that I thought maybe I should take a little bit of time to unpack. Many of these books, again, unlike Paul's letters, are the product of a social science that is really the construction in the last several hundred years of an epistemology of what some might call positivism. That is that when you read these books, you get kind of this mix of so-called qualitative and quantitative methods that help to demonstrate that we know something about leadership. And here I was struck by this sentence, in part because I do work in social science and statistics and educational measurement. So I was fascinated by this claim, again, in relationship to shared vision. Researchers have shown how leaders who focus on the future attract followers more readily, induce more effort and intrinsic motivation from group members, promote group identification, mobilize collective action, and ultimately achieve better performance on measures of both individual and organizational outcomes. So in some sense, what's being now positioned about leadership is not just personal testimony or stories that might be more consistent with the way in which Paul's genre of discourse works. But now we're getting something called science. And this science raises all sorts of challenges about incommensurability between the texts. What Rorty suggests we might call final vocabularies that have a relative relationship to each other, but no absolute relation. I'm even thinking about when we mentioned last time Gadamer and the problem of truth and method, that you can see in these particular kinds of statements an attempt to break free from historically affected consciousness. So while the text is situated and feels familiar when we're talking about on, suddenly now it takes on another kind of impetus, which is almost like it is objective and it's something that we know and it's something that we can quantify. And perhaps as importantly, it's something that we can measure in terms of outcomes, which really, if you step back and again, differentiate Paulinian text, argument, rhetoric from this kind of text and rhetoric, it reminds you that there is a strong psychology and social science agenda inside of modern leadership stories. One example would be Duckworth's work on grit. Duckworth has pursued for nearly now 20 years a thesis regarding those who have grit and those who do not have it, or those who have more of it and those who don't. And the word grit itself is a construct that is tied to perseverance and delayed gratification. But the big idea is that somehow perseverance, like the kind that Paul might have demonstrated in a case, can be quantified by using a 12-item Likert-style survey, and that we can think about the ways in which method can bring us to truth. And so again, I just want to take a moment to sort of step back and say, our study of comparisons between texts breaks down at the moment somebody wants to impose this kind of methodology on leadership. It also invites interesting questions like, was Paul gritty? Was the Jesus movement value added in terms of its impact? What is an acceptable effect size or impact for intrinsic motivation, which is one of the factors described here, on congregational outputs? When you start to try and marry or connect or even have these texts talk to each other, it becomes very strange. So again, we just point out that there are parallels and there are ways to analogize, and then there are moves that are made within this text that suggest quite a bit of distance from Paul.
I now had a question.
Yes, I
about,
can't see it, so please help me. I'm not operating from seeing the chat, so please let me know.
Okay, well, I can take the question.
Yeah.
Anna. One thing which struck me as I read the book is that the examples which are used come from all over the world. And so there's there's an attempt to be inclusive, gender inclusive, and inclusive of all sorts of, of all countries in the world. Many examples from India, from South Africa, from Asia, etc. One, what made me uncomfortable also is that this is meant to support the claim of the book that wherever you are, with whoever you are, in whichever culture you are, this is going to work. What they propose in the book is going to work, which, for me, it is questionable. But I see the claim and I see the attempt to support it. It's just at the end that I'm not absolutely sure. When I was reading about it, it reminded me of a comment that a former colleague of mine made once at a meeting, is that sometimes, especially in the US, every person in the world is considered to be an American. They have different colors, they speak different languages, but if you scratch underneath, we're all saying Americans like ourselves. She called it the Disney World mentality. It's a small world. Everyone has a different color, but sings the same song.
Yeah, it's
So
even
that was a very good, that's a good question, because I keep asking myself when I read all these examples, can you completely obliterate the different cultures? My answer is no, but the claim of the book is no, culture doesn't make any difference when you're using that book.
And that's going to bring us back to a more general problem, which is situated in the idea of the leadership wisdom tradition. So we had talked about there are many wisdom traditions. In the leadership wisdom tradition, you are called to act. And here again is another quote that reminds us of exactly what you're called to do. You have to find something that's so important that you're willing to put in the time, suffer the inevitable setbacks, and make the necessary sacrifices. Without an intense desire, a solemn concern, a consuming question, a grave proposition, a fondest hope, or a cherished dream, you can't ignite the spark necessary to energize aspirations and actions. What that something is, your sense of meaning and purpose, that has to come from within. And you'll notice that I underlined for emphasis. So in addition to perhaps the notion that there is a universal American waiting to climb out of every other corporeal body, I think there's also the notion of there is a Kantian self, a Kantian I, that is the focal point for initiating and explaining all change. So in some sense, you could ask the question, does Paul anticipate this development, or does his leadership model resist it? In other words, when we think about collective versus personal salvation theologies, we might wonder the way in which Paul is not necessarily signaling the Cartesian or the Kantian I. But when you read these books, a lot of it's down to you, and you is nothing more than the me for others, or the I that is acting. And so without putting too fine a point on it, not only is there not a structural analysis, not only is there not some kind of analysis of organizations, ecosystems, resources, the degree to which things are semi-constrained or semi-determined in part by structure. Instead, you have this I that is capable of anything as long as they look from within, which again would appear to be a way to read Paul. But pushing back on that reading, one could say, no, Paul is actually about a form of collective salvation that comes through Christ for Gentiles to Israel. So it's not simply about, I got it, I'm saved. And these books don't really give you the feeling of, while they talk about collaboration or collective project or the assembly, which is sort of a set of objects around you, you get the feeling that it's you who has to be the one to manipulate and make those things come to life for you. Was there a question in the chat or a comment?
Yeah, there's another question by Anna. Perhaps can you ask it and to unpack it, Anna?
Yeah, sorry for my poor English, and if I'm not able to ask my question, I might ask Jean-François to translate it. But it's very interesting to reflect on this idea of being called for leading, because it's completely different from what we live today. And we live in a very narcissistic world where entrepreneurs are usually legitimating their action by this idea of I found a cause, or I found a reason to act, but it's important to me instead of important to others or to humanity or to whatever. And I was wondering, how does this feeling of that something is important is built? And it's not something that's personal, it's something that's social. So leadership is not an individual affair. It's something that's dealing with the community you were talking about, this body we are living in. And well, I was trying to reconnect this idea of a body and this idea of this something that's so important. Where does that come from?
Yeah, you're, by the way, I only wish my French could even be 1/100th of your English. So I think I completely understood you. I would say on it that also they, in fairness to the text, the book we're referring to, they do say strengthen others in chapter 10. So there is this idea of a collective body that needs to be working in unison and with degree of cooperation, which we'll describe in a minute as sort of the problem of unification with the particulars. But having said that, it still has this feeling like you're suggesting that the body collective action, the project has been lost because so much of it's about you being an agent to affect something called change. So yeah, I totally agree with what you're pointing out. And I think it's consistent with our implicit, if not critique, at least curiosity about how could this be like Paul and how can it not be like Paul? And how do we impose on Paul a certain kind of entrepreneurial view, right? Which may not be the right view to impose upon him, which I think a deeper question as well. Anyone else want to say anything before we go to the next segment? We're glad to chat.
Yes, there's Claude and Jean-François Garneau. Also, Anna, perhaps I could add that I've been working in theological school at the present theological school for almost 20 years now, and we train people for ministry in in churches, usually Roman Catholic institutions. One thing, listening to students is always to listen about what took them to our school to train for ministry. And half of our students are Jesuits in training. The training for Jesuits is a 10-year-long training. So you really need to know that you're called to do that work. And that what strikes me is for how long sometimes people try to know whether they were called to do that kind of work. And it's, sometimes it's a very difficult process full of doubts. But they won't make the move unless they are really sure that there's something beyond simply their own personal interests in getting in that school. Because especially for Jesuits, they're going to commit 10 years of their life to that kind of training. So you need to be sure that the call is very strong and you cannot ignore it. Now, Claude had something, and Jean-François Garneau after. Claude, go ahead.
First I have to unmute. And you cannot be a leader if it's not leadership about your own personal convictions. And I think that it's universal. That's the frame, the basis to become a leader. If it's not important for you, you cannot lead, because you cannot put energy and all your life to help people connect to you and be part of your movement. But the way you express your leadership is more cultural. So it may depend of your culture, of the Chinese communists will express their leadership differently than maybe Jesuit in, or maybe likely with like Jesuit. But it will depend on their own culture and the way people want to hear about your own personal convictions.
Yeah, that seems to be another critical issue, which is, as you said, if the I or the self, which is the personal, which comes forward into the world, right, as a kind of agent who has to have a kind of dynamism, a dynamo behind, you know, and that is merely ego, merely narcissism, merely the idea of self-reflection. Donald Trump would be a nice example. Then we can say, well, he certainly is a leader who's driven to lead because he has a passion to get, you know, something done. But then you point out it also is expressed culturally in terms of who he can talk to and who will listen and who he can lead. And then we might add this other point, I think, which is still missing, which is the social good, the ethical good.
Yeah.
In other words, you know, what are you leading for? In addition to why are you motivated to choose to lead or not to lead?
Yeah.
I think Paul has more of that sense of the ethical component of his own leadership, which is personal, it's cultural, but it's also social. Would you agree?
Yeah. And it cannot, you cannot lead for something that is only important for you and not for the other people. You have to be part of and access to a better common good. If you want to bring people together.
Yes.
And in French, I say, on doit incarner la cause pour laquelle on agit. So it's a sort of incarnation of the cause that you belong to. And if you cannot be the champion and project an image of the cause that you are working for, you cannot be a leader.
Nice.
Yes.
Let's
Yeah.
take one more thought and then we can continue to move. I think there's another person who wanted to share.
Yeah, Jean-François Garneau.
I know.
There's two ideas that that came to my mind listening to you, and the most important idea I got from you guys is this idea of building the body. I hadn't really thought of it this way, and it's very important. One of the things you didn't bring up and could link the idea of Claude about the necessity of personal conviction for leading and the non-narcissistic way of Paul of conceiving that, is that Paul in Romans speaks that we are in the pains of begetting. So he sees this body of Christ as being something that is being born and himself called by this body to bring it forward. And he sees him and the community as being in the pains of getting this body born. It would explain the calling, it would explain the building, it would give a more natural process to the whole thing rather than a mechanical aspect to the building of the body. And it would link more to the idea of sowing and of the biological process. So that's one point, and I would link that to an idea in sociology. A lot of important sociological ideas were first developed by the right-wing side of the debate after the French Revolution. So a number of great sociologists or proto-sociologists were actually militant against the French Revolution, and they had a problem with the Declaration of Individual Rights of 1789. And one such attempt was done by a French ideologue called Blanc de Saint-Bonnet, who is the first one to have theorized the fact that language speaks through us rather than us speaking the language. And I think Gilles Vigneault in his song Les gens de mon pays, gets on this idea as well. He sings at one point, c'est moi qui t'appelle ou vous qui m'appelez, langage de mon père ou patois 17e. So he goes, and this is exactly the idea of Blanc Saint-Bonnet about language. And you can see the French structuralists trying to formalize this thing in the 1960s about the idea of the language. Do we speak a language, or is it language that speaks through us? This is this idea. And I would link this, the idea of, is it the body of Christ that speaks through us and is calling to be born? Or is it me who brings about the body of Christ? There's a parallel to be done. And I was just, and I think you were so close to doing it. So I thought, and I would never have thought of that if you hadn't spoken. I thought you might want to explore this. I have another idea. I shared it to you guys with by mail. There is a guy who is barely known yet, who I befriended on Facebook, who is our age, perhaps a bit younger, who is an art critic in France, called Marc Alizard. And he wrote an extraordinary book on philosophy of theology or philosophy of sociology, whatever you want to call it. It's called Pop Theology. This particular book has not been translated in English, but he argues that we don't live in a secularized world. We live in a hyper-Protestant world. And he takes the history of Protestantism in the US and shows how not only your theory of leadership is not secularized Christianism, in fact, it is Protestantism pushed to an extreme. Right. And so he turns the idea of secularization on its head, and he says, no, we don't suffer from secularization. We suffer from heresy having gone wild.
Well, I'll be interested in those connections again.
So that could be very interesting. I think that everything that this guy wrote is worth the detour, and some of them are translated in English, a number in Italian and in Spanish, but this particular one is only in French.
Okay, so this is good. These connections are super helpful, and I think this goes back to the talk really should be inviting us for not only detours but possibilities not yet envisioned. So let's continue to go forward with the story we're telling, which is one that has to do with situating Paul, one that has to do with situating the leadership standard model literatures, which we can debate what their roots are, but we clearly know that they position the self, the I, the agency as a feature of the storytelling regarding leadership. Now let's take a look back at Paul's problems, Paul's challenges, what Paul is facing, because this is where it gets interesting and what really motivated us to do this work. Paul is in fact one of many leaders in the Corinthian assembly. According to his own admission, it's from Paul that we learn that there are actually different forms and actors that are engaged in the project in Corinth. And so we're going to start with two basic distinctions. There are those who we might call or members of the local leadership team. We might call this sort of a distributed model where we have Chloe's people, we have Stephanus and his household, and we also have Fortunatus and Achaicus. Now, we have a good sense of who Chloe is, and we described her a bit last time. Stephanus is an actor who shows up a couple times in 1 Corinthians, could be seen as somebody who's simply a good friend of Paul's and is moving correspondence and ideas back and forth. But again, there's a sense in which these are trusted people for Paul. He wouldn't be mentioning them. And so we can imagine that they have influence, some kind of influencer relationship to these households in Corinth. That's the local scene. But the interesting point that Paul makes is his awareness that there's also kind of a contested global or regional leadership in the peninsula and what we call Macedonia now. That there are people coming from Alexandria and Jerusalem and making their way into these different communities. And one that's named is Apollos. We don't know much about Apollos, unfortunately. We wish we knew more because apparently he was influential. As we noted earlier, Paul says that he's someone who waters the garden. He's somebody who is effective, at least in terms of his ability to add value to the project. Peter, of course, is Peter, or Cephas. So we know that Peter has great stature across many different biblical records. And so Paul is in the world in Corinth, but he knows that Peter's come and gone and Apollos has come and gone. Maybe they've even hung out for a while. We're not quite sure of the timelines, but it's important to point out that Paul's aware at two levels. There's the level at which within the group what's going on, and there's a level sort of a step above it, which is how are different apostles or people with strong influence cutting across these different communities. If we think about this a little bit more deeply, I think I'm going to pivot over now to our good friend JF. Why don't you go ahead and take us through?
Okay, so can we move to the next slide?
Sergeant Faisal.
Yeah, so that's again in Corinth. There would have been several, as we mentioned, there would be house churches. And whenever they come together on a weekly or monthly basis, they become really the Church of Corinth, which is more or less a confederation of house churches. And you can assume that there are leaders for every house church. One possible leader could be Chloe, who's a householder, likely a householder, and she has employees. One other possible leader, local leader, could be Stephanus, who's mentioned both at the very beginning of the letter and also at the end. And one hypothesis, because Stephanus is present when Paul is finishing to draft the first letter to the Corinthians. So Stephanus could be the letter carrier, bringing the letter back to Corinth. He may have brought to Paul the letter from the Corinthians to which Paul responds, and he's bringing back Paul's letters to Corinth to be read and shared in this monthly or weekly assembly of all these house churches. Fortunatus and Achaicus are also mentioned at the very end of the letter. They are likely also part of the leadership, the local leadership team. But what we should sense here is that there's probably Paul acts as a translocal leader for that church, but there are also local leaders, and we don't know how many of them. Some are named. We're unclear about their role, but they indeed play a role. So what what Paul has to do is to work with these local leaders, and they report to him about what's going on in Corinth with these groups, and they also converse with Paul, asking, taking his opinions, his advice on things, reporting to him. Stephanus and his household are also doing the same thing. And at the same time, there are other translocal leaders who are going to visit the group. So Peter has visited at least once, and Apollos has visited at least once, and the Corinthians also have asked Paul, when is Apollos supposed to return? And they assume, by asking Paul when Apollos is supposed to return, they assume that Paul is in touch with Apollos. So let's move now to some case studies where we can focus on specific situations of leadership. So we have these 4 cases. They are distributed through the letters, to the letter of 1 Corinthians. Actually, 1 Corinthians is replete with issues where Paul has to exercise leadership. And Brent and I discussed a lot before coming to this selection, simply because we wanted to provide different situations, just to get you a sense that there's diversity. But let's say that we had to discard ones, and it was a tough choice.
It was hard to give up the resurrection.
Yeah, it was hard to give up the resurrection. It was hard to give up also eating meat, the diet.
That's
But,
true.
okay, that will.
So again, back to the idea of kind of what matters for leadership in the modern leadership discourse, we figured that if we pick cases that were authentic to Paul's own experience as best we could discern it, while at the same time being somewhat generalizable to problems of organization that certainly we've observed, dealing with factions or division is certainly not unknown to most leaders today. Setting boundaries and defining missions and redefining them is certainly not unknown to anyone today. Drafting policies, this is almost standard operating procedure for most organizations. And again, the need to continually recenter on core values as people engage in mission creep, or they lose focus and forget their core competencies, as is often called in the business literature. So we felt like these 4 would be useful. Actually, we decided that we would share them. So I'm going to take the dealing with factions and recenter on core values, and Jean-Francois is going to take setting boundaries and drafting policies. So if we start with the question of dealing with factions, we know that Chloe's people are stating that there are several factions. And specifically, Paul writes in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians that there are 4 basic groupings. There's a group that say, I belong to Paul. There's a group that say, I belong to Apollos. There's a group that say, I belong to Peter. And there's a group that say, I belong to Christ. And this is in itself fascinating because, again, this leader, Paul, is positioning himself vis-a-vis the claims from his close informants that there are basically 4 camps. And several house churches may have had a preference for different leaders. We suspect that while leaders may have come and dropped by different houses, it may turn out that there are natural alliances. And we do know that, according to Paul, all of these leaders visited Corinth. Of course, we say except the Christ faction, because this is one of the most interesting groups, and I'll say a bit more about them in a second. Some of the leaders may have established house churches. Paul clearly claims that he establishes, he's a master builder, but they may have also won adherence to baptism. There's a discussion in this chapter about, well, who baptized you? I don't remember if I baptized you. Maybe I baptized some of you. Paul again pointing out that baptism is creating some kind of social solidarity and that it may actually lead people astray. So I want to point out here that we can pretty much say that, yeah, there are folks who are for Paul, there are folks that are for Apollos, there are folks that are for Peter, but this I belong to Christ, when I first encountered this and I talked with Jean-Francois about it, it seemed to me that it hinted at the possibility of those who are more interested in what we might call a flat organization or a non-leader-led organization, or those who seek some sort of direct, unmediated relationship with Christ. We can't be sure of this, but we can be sure that the Christ faction is in some sense without a specific person that can be named. And that in itself, for me, is interesting because I was wondering if it signals that even in the early formation of these assemblies, these early Christ movements, there's already a sense that some don't want to be for a figurehead or for an individual leader, but would rather be in some kind of congregation that is less leader-centric. And I'm thinking here about American Quakers. I'm thinking about people who have taken a certain form of Protestant gospel and see it as a virtue if it is leaderless, but more of a collective. Whereas other Christian organizations have placed obviously leaders in relationship and ultimately start differentiating those relationships. Roman Catholicism being the most developed form, where the Pope is seen as the literal top of the food chain, so to speak. in terms of thinking about how you play out leadership. So again, is this an early hint of that, or is it just some strange anomaly that Paul names, but we can't read much more into? In any event, we do know that there was at least 2 others who were competing in faction or division with Paul. Paul, knowing this, does what we call modeling the way. And here we borrow again self-consciously from the leadership challenge. And this is where we saw a very interesting affinity between Paul and the way he handles this challenge and the kinds of suggestions, normative suggestions that are made by the modern standard model of leadership today. He faces the situation. He clarifies the values, that there's only one Christ. He affirms that Christ is a shared value by all. He sets the example by subsuming himself under Christ. And he asks purposeful questions. Each one of these are actually directly taken out of the text in terms of ways to lead forward. Has Christ been divided, Paul asks? And of course, that's partly rhetorical, and it's also meant to be instructive. No, he is not, according to Paul. Was Paul crucified for you? Again, Paul's decentering the notion that any one leader could in any way be thought of as Christ. No one is, in fact, running the situation as if they were God. I think this is a very important piece in Paul's early work to identify for us the dangers of cult of personality and worshiping those who claim God but may in fact not be. So Paul puts that right out there for everyone to think about. He also asks people to think about, were you baptized in the name of Paul? Again, who you were baptized in the name of may or may not be relevant to the real question, which is, do we share the fundamental values of what it means to affirm and walk in Christ? So factions are a problem, and the standard model seems to have a suggested pathway for understanding Paul's leadership. On the other hand, part of our case approach is to show the resistances to the standard model, to push back on that idea that every single thing can be subsumed into this modern framework of the leadership challenge. So we tested this. First of all, we note that Paul isn't a well-capitalized entrepreneur who can hire and fire. So whatever leadership is, when one leads and is a manager, one has the power generally to hire and fire. Paul doesn't have that. Paul doesn't also have the kinds of organizational structures and policy levers that almost every single leader in any major organization has today. Those policy levers can be used to manage or offload conflict, to actually take conflict out of the hands of the leader and put it in the hands of somebody else to handle so-called the problem. There's no human resource division in Paul's world. So he can't take climate surveys or put together focus and affinity groups and weekend retreats to try to figure out what's the problem here and how can we solve it and how can the team get together. He doesn't have access to those kinds of tools. And perhaps most interestingly, although over time this actually seems to evolve for the church, at his time, there are no board of directors to counsel or dilute his personal responsibility or what will be attached to him as his responsibility. At some point, we recognize Paul must have really irritated, annoyed, and made the Corinthians upset, because 2 Corinthians is a reconciliation letter. It's an acknowledgement of leadership gone too far. But the point is, he doesn't even have at his disposal a way to sort of say, well, let's counsel the board and get some advice from them on how I might proceed. So the standard model, by the way, itself doesn't acknowledge these forces typically within organizations. As I read through this book again and again, I noticed that, again, there's such an emphasis on agency and values and beliefs, and they decenter in the leadership challenge the notion of kind of the law, policy, structures, roles that are often used by leaders to their advantage or sometimes disadvantage.
Okay, and let's go to our second case, unless there are questions about the first one.
Yeah, does anyone ask about the first case?
Okay, let's therefore move with
Question.
second.
Oh
Yeah, go ahead, Claude.
Yeah, because trying to fit Paul into a 20th century model.
Yeah.
We're showing that it's not possible, right? We're
Yeah,
showing
it's-
where the limits are.
It's not
of this
always
kind of work.
possible. But did current people recognize Paul as a leader? And if so, what are the cues that you can show us to prove that the current churches recognize Paul as a leader?
What I would say is first, they refer to him. They
Okay.
defer to him when there's an issue. On the one hand, through an oral report of what's going on in Corinth by Chloe's people, and they send him a letter with questions.
Okay.
And where they explain an issue and they ask, okay, what you have to say about this issue.
Okay.
Now, the big question is how much what it suggests is going to be implemented. We don't have that follow. Well, we have 2 Corinthians, which is partially a follow-up, but not a very methodical follow-up about the
Okay.
the advice that he had given in 1 Corinthians.
Because usually you cannot express yourself as a leader if people don't recognize you as a leader.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, Cloud, it's a good point too to ask, since we don't have any correspondence with Apollos, right?
Okay.
And we don't have any correspondence with Peter, right?
Yeah.
We're missing the degree to which people not only perceived Paul as the leader or a leader, or just one leader of many, but I think we're inferring, as Jean-Francois says, that, well, the fact is they did ask him for counsel. They did read his letter aloud, and there is evidence that they responded and he responded to it. So there is a dialogue, but he's not a leader like a CEO, right? That's not the kind of, and he's not even a leader like a Roman proconsul. He's not a leader like Caesar. He's not necessarily a leader like, the standard forms of the person in charge in this period. So, but he does lead, it would seem, with a degree of respect and legitimacy because people have gone to him for advice.
Yeah.
And they continue the correspondence. Yeah. Yeah.
What certainly the text shows is that one person in Corinth called Chloe either is a leader and is being overwhelmed and is trying to use Paul's intervention as an argument to beef up her own authority that is contested, or is not a leader but is trying to meddle and gain more authority within her community by bringing Paul into the fight. So that's one observation to Claude. The second one is we tend to view action in modernity since Descartes through a vertical division of things, with behavior at the bottom and action at the top when it's undertaken by the will. Therefore, we tend to see leadership as being related to the ability to will change or to will authority and so on. Ancients tended to view action not in a vertical way, but in a horizontal time way. That is, the authority belonged to the founder, and if you want to determine if somebody has auctoritas, you look at who founded Rome, you look at who founded the business, and so on. And if Paul is the founder of the Church of Corinth, then he has authority on the Church of Corinth because the tradition is what he founded. There cannot be tradition if it's not the transmission through time of the act of founding. So the entrepreneur is, that's what we would call the entrepreneur. So there is this very, very strong, the verb in Latin, agere, is about founding. It's not acting, agere, that gives us actus sum. And the verb for continuing a tradition and through the ages is called gerere, to manage, to gérer. And it's akin to gestation, to beget, to bring a child to be born. And so I would say that if you want to look at to ask the question, is Paul a leader? Obviously, you cannot answer it the way he's not a CEO and so on, but there are clues that he would be a leader just because he founded it. So if it's a fact that he founded the church in Corinth, then he has an auctoritas, an authority, just because he's a founder. And it's not being a leader, it's being a founder that matters for.
Yeah, but you know, I would challenge the claim that Paul is a founder of the Church of Corinth.
There.
I would say that he's probably the founder of a house church or 2 house churches in Corinth, but other leaders have visited who may have also established other house churches. Again, the Church of Corinth is more or less a federation of house churches. So Paul may be seen as one of the founders of that church, which again puts him in a position where he has to negotiate.
Yeah, that's his posture problem. But I like the point that Garneau made in terms of if we just followed the text literally and asked, where's the assertion? Paul asserts himself as the founder in the way that you're saying the ancients understood the
Yes.
honor and veneration. And that Apollos at best is a guy who walks around with a can of water to watch things grow. So if we think about origination, planting seeds, the notion of an agricultural metaphor, clearly Paul has the seeds and he's the one who puts them into play. And then everyone else comes and just kind of tends to the garden and waters it and perhaps just, and then again, God gives the increase. But back to your point, yeah, I think I like that Claude sort of pushed us on the question of how do we know that Paul's a leader, or what would be the way in which we would test that out. And we do have to take it on self-report to some extent. But then that begs the question, right? If there are many leaders or many founders or many who have different visions for what the church may be, this is where our test cases come into play. We don't have Apollos' reactions to setting boundaries. We don't have Peter's notions of faction. We only have Paul's. So let's continue to pursue what we have, which is Paul telling us about what's important for this community as a leader, what he sees as what needs to happen. Do you want to go ahead, Jean-Francois?
Yes, going ahead. So we move to the second case, which is found in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians. And what we'll see there is this notion of setting boundaries. So what's the problem in Corinth? And Paul has heard about this, likely from Chloe's people. So there's a man who lives with his stepmother. And Paul immediately says, well, this is unacceptable in terms of behavior. It's unacceptable even among pagans. Now, this is not also innocent to say that it's unacceptable among pagans. It's like if these people are not pagans anymore. But, you know, for the people, for the Jews of that time, they are not Jews either. So they are in this kind of in-between space. But Paul denies them the status that they are pagans. But anyway, this is unacceptable even among pagans as a behavior. It's also against Torah. And here it's again the purity code of the book of Leviticus. The other aspect that probably upsets Paul, and he's clear about this, is that there's been no condemnation of that behavior from the Corinthian assembly. So when the house churches come together, no one has spoken against what's going on. No one has addressed the problem. And, you know, how did this thing arise? We have to perhaps look at the next chapter in 1 Corinthians, where Paul cites likely one of a slogan that would have been used by one house church or several house churches, that since now they are part of the body of Christ, everything is permitted, everything goes. You can do whatever you want because now you're in and you don't have to worry anymore that you could be kicked out of the body of Christ. And Paul doesn't see things that way. And again, what you have here is the discourse about the body. In chapter 6, he returns to the house church, that the church of Corinth being a temple, being the body of Christ. The body is holy, shouldn't be polluted. So the other aspect of this, and we can see this in many cases in the letter in First Corinthians, is Paul is very careful about the public image of that group. What do people around are going to think about them? And this aspect returns in several discussions. There's something about preserving a good image. So the pollution of the body in Corinth has far-reaching implications that for the people of Corinth around who are not part of that movement and are suspicious of these people, that could give bad press to the church of Corinth. So what does Paul do here is, well, he's still, he's still warm in his way to address them to a point, but he's a very determined enforcer of Torah, of that part of the book of Leviticus. So his leadership's here functions. What he does is he's a gatekeeper. If the local leaders are not able to set boundaries between what's acceptable and unacceptable, as a translocal leader, he's going to establish these boundaries and redirect those who who doesn't behave according to the expected standards. So if we go to our conversation partner, the leadership challenge, and we use it to read something of the situation and how Paul deals with it, you can say that indeed Paul challenges the process of what's going on here. He takes the initiative. Then this is part of what Kouzes and Posner suggest for leaders who challenge the process. You really have to be upfront and take the initiative. There's also a part of risk, of taking risks in leadership. You cannot always be on the back seat and wait for things to happen before reacting. You have to sometimes be upfront, means also taking a risk, not knowing whether this is going to be successful. So he gave a strict order, that is to expel the delinquent. And it's worth citing how he gives his order, how he formulates it. This is puzzling for us as we read that order. You are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. When you read the destruction of the flesh, is he telling them to execute that person, put him against the wall and shoot him? It's not really how flesh and spirit work in Paul's letters. Flesh and spirit are euphemism for attitudes. Someone who lives in the flesh is someone who really thinks, you would call this person materialistic nowadays. They simply live for the present moment, for their own, they seek their own pleasure, notwithstanding the harm they can cause around themselves.
This reminds one of the "you are fired" motif.
Yes. Yeah, and the one who lives according to the Spirit is the one who thinks in terms of spiritual things. And to put it in the Jesuit way, saying, always looking for the greater glory of God in everything. You're looking to please God. So what he tells them is that you kick him out So finally, he may think about his behavior, amend his ways, stop thinking about according to the flesh and start thinking about according to the spirit. And again, at the end of this statement, in order to preserve the integrity of the body. And he wants, the person is not condemned with any possibility to return. The whole idea of the process, as he spells it, is to redeem, to make sure that the person can be redeemed toward the end. Now, according to the leadership challenge, I said, this is where I find it ironic when I read with that book. One thing that a leader does is to enable people to act. Yes, but that's what he does in that way. In that case, the Corinthians, the Corinthian assembly, the Church of Corinth, is supposed to carry the sentence. They are going to do the dirty work. Paul gives orders about what should be done, but he's not going to be the one who carries a sentence. They are to do this.
In some ways, that sounds very familiar.
He moves it back to the local leadership to carry the sentence.
Okay.
Yes.
On this point, just to assert again the train of thought I mentioned last time I spoke, and I'm going to assert it, but it's really a question whether that can be read. Because the metaphor, the image you have in mind in describing Paul's work is building the body of Christ rather than letting. It's funny because you quote him as describing a biological process of a plant growing, and then you go into something like building a house. Then you have to make Satan a thing and so on. But if you think of Paul as somebody in prey of the social structure, he's socially determined to, but not to express tradition, but he senses in the zeitgeist, guys, that there's a body of Christ. There is the social structures are so organized that something is being born. Then his saying, you are to hand this man over to Satan, is that, okay, he doesn't want to be part of the new structure, let him be part of the structure that won't exist. So it doesn't mean you understand? It doesn't mean that there is a Satan as thing. Is that there's a process that is decaying and that is going nowhere, and there's this thing calling to life. So so let's not hurt the growing thing. And if he wants to be part of the thing that is decaying and that has no future, well, so be it. And that's what he would call Satan.
Yes. Yes. And I remember when I was teaching undergrad students at Université du Québec at Chicoutimi, we were talking about that passage, and there's a student that came up with one of the best explanations that I ever heard is, you hand him over to Satan, so he can choke himself with having too much of it.
Yeah.
That's the system also. That he can, once he's out and handed over to, he can fulfill all his passions until he really got fed up with it. Means, okay, go to the bottom, and once you've reached the bottom, you may be able to get back to us with with other dispositions.
So let's keep going.
Okay,
let's keep going with time.
Yes.
Can we take a break now, or do you want to?
We normally don't break, but this would be new for us to break.
Perhaps we can finish that case and take a 5-minute break.
Let's do that. Yeah, let's finish this case. We're almost there.
Yeah.
Yes. So resistance to the standard model. This is where the leadership model challenge shows its limitations. One thing that Paul does, and which is really what the leadership challenges tells not to do, whatever situation, don't shame, don't go to shame your audience. That's exactly what Paul does when he addresses this case. He shames, he puts this, he tells them, shame on you. The other thing also that he does as a translocal leader, he steps over the local leadership. He really walks on their toes to address the situation. The other aspect, Paul, so we've described him at some point as someone who's a collegial leader, and he uses the we, the first person plural, when he writes. In this particular case, he uses the emphatic first person personal pronoun. I myself have already judged and decided. There's no consultation. There's no collegiality. It's his voice who's making the decision. So there was no consultation with the assembly. There was no due process. He's not, he's not having an investigation with a third party to check the allegations and collecting information from all people involved. So what you have there at work is this underlying the principle of the preservation of the body against pollution, and you're going to do radical decisive surgery, that is amputation, if the body is under attack. If it can be infected and polluted. So that's, that, in terms of leadership model, in terms of matching the textbook, this would be a counterexample about how to exercise leadership.
Yeah, but Jean-François, you say that it's a counterexample, but I may say that it's a different model of leadership.
Yes.
That's been used in other cultural times, and was good for some leaders for a time, but this model can produce some goods.
Yes, and I'll say that, it runs against the textbook, but it was used in the past, but I will say that it's still used in the present.
Before we go to coffee, if I could just read from the good book here, quote, "When I was given a leadership role for the first time, I treated it as a powerful position. I used to follow a dictatorial style and found that I had a hard time winning my team's trust, and I saw resentment everywhere. I quickly realized my mistake and then started giving away my power to the team."
Yeah, but for nowadays it's a mistake. But
well, that's the advice of nowadays book. That's right. Yeah. So for Paul, he was an unreformed dictatorial leader, according to this text. But he would know better if he had gone through this training.
Yeah. Yes. Because good leader nowadays, they are asking us to do things that we would not like to do, especially about COVID-19. And we see them as good leaders.
But given that Paul used to persecute people when they disagreed with him, he underwent a way of Damascus sort of change of heart as to how to lead also.
Well, let's leave that for the coffee break. Let's leave that for the coffee break. So 5 minutes from now, is that what people wanted?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Good. Let's meet back in 5. And I can unshare, or are you just going to hit the stop record button, Garneau?
For a while, and I'll start again.
Sounds good. So, yeah.
Okay, third case about drafting policies this time. Let me tell you something about the situation. The main question is that these people meet, let's say, on a weekly basis or monthly basis and have a common meal together. Now, the question is, what is the common meal about? The situation from what you get in this chapter is that some people who come to that meal overeat and overdrink. And there's much left to your imagination about what means to overeat and overdrink. But also some people who come have little to eat and drink. So the people come for that meal. They don't come together necessarily. They don't wait for each other to eat together. One question that we may entertain here is that some of these people were likely familiar with meals in voluntary associations, because that was a feature of most voluntary associations, sometimes to have a weekly, a quarterly, monthly meal with all the members of the association. And that would be more or less, that would take the form of a symposium. What's a symposium in the Greco-Roman world, especially in the Greek-speaking world? It's a meal where you can indeed eat as much as you can and drink as much as you can. So that at the end of the meal, many people are underneath the table. Have rolled in underneath the table. There'll sometimes be adult entertainment provided during the symposium. So that's what also makes these meals in some associations very popular. What also you eat in a symposium depends of where you sit in the dining hall, and seating corresponds to social class. So you can imagine that those who sit on the upper table will have the caviar and the fancy wine, while the ones sitting in the lower table will have the white bread, the bologna, and the peanut butter. So that may be what's going on in the common meal in Corinth. People, these members just assume that what Paul has been talking about when he said that they should celebrate a common meal should be a symposium. And that's what they're trying to emulate. And they don't see any problem with this because this is the model which they know. The other thing also with research about voluntary associations in the Greco-Roman world is that there were many disputes over these notions of seating arrangement. So there were many sometimes reports processed from voluntary association that showed that people got mad at each other and they even sued each other in justice because they accused one family to steal their sitting place during the common meal. So the meals which were meant to get people together and have a good times, in many associations degenerated in strives and disputes because people felt that they were deprived of their rights. So what Paul does here to address this situation is, if you look at the leadership challenge, our go-to book is finally he clarifies values. How does he do this? As a good leader does in that book, not by spelling out principles in bullet points, but just by telling a story. And here he tells the foundational narrative for that meal. That is Jesus' last meal with his disciples. So Paul cites, tells about the last meal and gives an account of what happened on that day. And finally, what you get, and this is what you also get in the Gospels, Jesus' last meal with his disciples was not a symposium. It was a Passover meal. And what Paul drafts as a policy, when they come together, it shouldn't be a symposium. That's not what they should try to emulate. It should rather be a Passover meal where they should all wait for each other and they should distribute food equally among those who participate in the meal. So no differentiated diet, depending of your sitting place, which corresponds also to your social class. Now, if you go to, again, the leadership challenge, and if we can switch to the next slide. Oh, no, let's get back to, I forgot one piece. Yeah, there's also a warning with when Paul explains what they should be trying to do. If you don't eat that meal properly, it can kill you. And it has to do with also the matter of the body. Let's go to the next slide now. So there's something also in Paul's drafting policies that resist the model spelled out in the leadership challenge. If you go to the book and you do a word search, the word celebration or celebrate, cognates, is found 98 times. So the leadership challenge is clear that we should find occasions, leaders should find and create occasions to celebrate achievements and to celebrate all sorts of things. You have to be creative in finding ways to celebrate. Indeed, the common meal was seen as a celebration, but what Paul does, finally, he almost kills the fun in the celebration. It becomes a very sober celebration where people are going to all eat the same thing. And Paul says that if you're hungry, you should eat at home before coming to the common meal. So it may sound like what you see in many churches nowadays. You have your very tiny piece of bread and your sip of wine, and that's it. You're supposed to have fun.
Jean-Francois?
Yes.
Can I just note that in the leadership challenge, they quote Terrence Deal and a community psychologist, clinical psychologist, M.K. Key, in their book called The Corporate Celebration. So apparently there's an entire literature and book on this. Yes. They include opportunities such as cyclical celebrations, recognition ceremonies, celebrations of triumph, rituals for comfort and letting go, personal transition celebrations, workplace altruism, and play. And they notice things like games and sporting event and spoofing and poking fun. This doesn't sound very Paulinian as far as I can tell at the moment.
Indeed not. And well, depending of your the organization for which you work, I work in an organization that takes this very serious celebration very seriously. And the leadership challenge even quotes the one person from Santa Clara University as a master in organizing celebrations. And I can acknowledge that the guy is really indeed about celebrating all sorts of aspects in the life of the organization. But what Paul does really is to have a celebration, but it's so sober that it kills the fun of it. It comes also with this warning that it can kill you if you do it improperly. And what is there is with this warning is that you should discern the body. You should discern how the body of Christ is featured in these celebrations. If you miss this aspect of being the body of Christ, indeed, it can make you sick. It can kill you. The body of Christ, it's also conceived as a sacred meal. And as we know from many religious traditions, the sacred can be beneficial if you know how to approach it. But it can kill you if you are not fit to approach it. And the best analogy could be electricity. Electricity can be beneficial if you know how to connect your wires, but if you don't, it can be lethal. So Paul makes this meal, which for many Corinthians would have been the fun symposium, into a sacred meal, beneficial on the one hand if you're fit for it, but also potentially lethal if you're unfit. What also Paul does that goes against the standard model is he's micromanaging everything that should happen at the meal. And this is what bad managers do. They step into the details of things. They don't give latitude to the members of the organizations, to the local leaders, and they they kill the creativity, the latitude of people. So the preservation, what you understand from this case is at the end, the preservation of the body, of the purity of the body, will trump every other aspect, especially when it comes to celebration.
So Claude has made a really interesting point in the
Yes.
chat. He says, so Paul is building new standards for eating, like the heavy Torah, question mark.
Yes, exactly. This is where you find in Paul's letters that on the one hand, it's Torah light when it comes to circumcision.
Yeah.
Dietary laws. It's not questioning what they should have on the table. They can have pork chops. There's no problem. But the way they're going to consume the meal is highly regulated and makes it, a Torah, a Passover meal, which is something described in Torah.
So can we say that he changes standards after people have been have adhered to the new church?
Yes. And what you can say also that there was probably miscommunication on his part in the first place.
Okay.
When these people were told that they should have a common meal, there were no specific guidelines about what it should be and how it should be organized.
Yeah.
Just when he hears that this is what they have understood, that he comes with guidelines because there were no such guidelines in the first place.
And in fairness to Paul, today's corporate managers know that you need to sometimes produce training videos, and you have to give exemplars of practice, and you have to provide cases and examples. And of course, Paul has no access to that, so he has to write out in some sort of heavy-handed language that one ought to start to think about doing things the right way. I think the deeper point, though, Claude, is I thought about this a lot. It's almost like if you were very cynical, you would suggest that Paul uses a bait and switch strategy, which is that on the one hand, you reduce the Torah barrier in two areas that would have made it very hard for Gentiles to participate. But the moment people are inside and moving towards the body with you, now you bring to them things that they may not have known or signed up for initially when they decided to join the movement. I think less cynically, one could just say that Paul actually has to navigate the transition of culture to culture. So he becomes a broker, and he's stuck with the position of leading from what they expect and understand to be normal, let's say eating pork chops and snails and rats, to a sense of, well, you can eat those things, but let's not act like rats or snails or other animal forms when we actually engage one another. Let's transcend and go above and beyond that. So it's this negotiation, how to bring them in, but at the same time, how to make sure that they're elevated.
Yeah.
And it's, it's a part of the beauty of what he does, that he sees that, but it also can appear like micromanaging and harsh. Jean-Francois, did you want to say more about drafting policies before we go to the last case?
Well, again, this is one of the places where we picked that case because at the end, when you've done reading the chapter, there you have a clear policy. and this is what sometimes leaders have to do, is when there's a vacuum about policies, they have to show the way about drafting ones and coming with a clear understanding for everyone. How he does this, again, it's mostly imposed top down.
Right.
With, there's latitude left, but he's given a very specific guidelines about what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, and I think that also blows apart the very naive conception of Paul as someone who simply abrogates the law and has transcended it through his faith, and is less concerned with the rituals of spiritual practice than the so-called Pharisee. That cartoonish notion really is not upheld in the reading of Paul's very practical concern for how people engage one another in the community. This is a great example where he is really trying to figure as he goes how to communicate what remains in Torah, or even just the spirit of Torah, we might say, and that is communal meals that have a sober, respectful, caring approach rather than debauchery and simple joy and fun. So again, should we transition?
Yes, yeah, let's keep going.
So the next case, the last case, is on recentering on core values, and this is a critical idea that comes through the leadership challenge. In Paul's situation, he noticed a curious situation, which is that it was both reported, and I also suspect that he observed from his own experience of different communities, that there were many spiritual gifts, what we might even call talents or skills or competencies or proficiencies that were on display inside the Corinthian churches. And he names them, and the translations that we get in English out of the Greek are a bit tricky, but we can generally discern their meaning. There apparently were deeds of power that some have the gift and skill to offer. There were gifts of healing that were on display inside of the communities. There were forms of assistance and administration, people who could coordinate the houses and the activities. And of course, most interestingly, which he spends quite a bit of time on relative to this chapter, these two chapters, various kinds of tongues. Tongues were a critical feature of what was going on in Corinth. And so he's attempting to make sense of this as a leader and to try to help parse what these gifts mean and the way in which they relate to the body. Now, we know that Paul acknowledges that the gift of speaking in tongues was obviously important because it was likely ranked as an important gift. That is, some could do it, and there were those who perhaps couldn't do it. And he gives us the sense that part of his concern is that the community is, in some sense, prioritizing, or we might say even just simply glorifying certain gifts over others. And this has an impact on the body. In that sense, the spiritual gifts that you would celebrate normally inside of any community are dividing rather than uniting the Corinthians. And this is another form of faction and division. So Paul isn't only concerned about the leadership that's contested, but he's also concerned about the skills, dispositions, and perhaps attitudes that are on display. And it appears that some may have placed themselves kind of above the fray, perhaps because in the ecstatic condition of tongues, it appears more spectacular, maybe even more magical, more interesting. It's kind of like, I like to think of it as, I always feel myself not as gifted teacher as some, because I just don't have those great metaphors and always those great stories to tell. But also, I was thinking about how some people really know how to connect with the audience, and they can magically make a kind of electrifying experience occur. And that may be, again, part of the problem, that Paul sees this energy at work, but it doesn't appear to be uniting people. And so he brings about, very specifically, again, back to the question of the body, that the human body has many parts, and he actually describes some of those parts. And he notes that they are all essential and that no part is superior to another. And this has implications for the assembly. Yes, the assemblies are made of many people with different spiritual gifts, but all gifts and people are essential to the project at hand. And no one gift is superior to another. We might compare this, by the way, to Plato and Hobbes, who have a much more hierarchical notion of the relationship of the body. Paul seems to be attempting to decenter that hierarchy, on the other hand, acknowledging that there is something that is in relationship to the whole. I like to think of Paul as maybe suggesting that people are all differently abled and that everybody can serve according to his ability and to his gift. So in some sense, there's a communalism in Paul's vision, and that communalism doesn't provide or provides a kind of spiritual division of labor that would be a hierarchy that would put some above others, but rather a leveling effect. He's interested in everyone seeing their connection to each other. That's part of his leadership strategy. So if we think of Paul as challenging certain assumptions, he asks very direct questions. And this is another one of the features of his practice as a leader. He challenges current assumptions. Are there such things as superior gifts? Are some people more talented than others? Can we say that with any degree of clarity or care or Christian virtue? Paul decides, no, we really can't. And he models the way, which goes back to, again, the language of the leadership challenge. He clarifies values. That is, we are, or at least must be, a united body. It's an interesting question whether it's descriptive or normative, but in his mind, I think at a minimum, Christ unifies, and if we're all divided, and if we're all in faction or boasting about our particular gifts, we're missing the point. He asks us to align our attitudes and actions with those core values, and those core values are prioritized in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where in a very small verse, but I think it's quite profound, questions whether it's formulaic or whether he really wants to recenter. I think he wants to recenter. Faith, love, and hope become the guiding principles. So whatever it is you do to be inside this community, if you can't align that with love, faith, and hope, and particularly love, then it seems to me that Paul's pointing out you're missing the mark. And again, this is part of Paul's, we could say, power of his leadership. He understands what the core principles are. Now, there is, as always, some resistance to the standard model, as we call it, of the leadership challenge. Part of that can be expressed in a quick search of terms, and I'm not completely convinced that word searches are the best way to go about methodologically discerning what the analogies or disanalogies are between words like love, between Paul and, let's say, the modern usage. There's all sorts of complications even about love in Paul's own discourse. But let's just start with this. The leadership challenge does mention the term love 40 times, faith 11 times, and the cognate hope 29 times. I did note, though, that when I was going through the index in terms of if you were to think about where the authors have prioritized particular possibilities for turning to understand more, none of these words show up. So they're peppered throughout the book, but one would have to really engage in a deeper qualitative triangulation of the way in which love is being used in any particular part of the text. The source of all gifts for Paul, unlike for the leadership challenge authors, emanates from God. So it's very hard to not only de-ontologize, but also de-theologize Paul's leadership model. The currency of secular leadership discourse is to make God absent. Not that God is absent or that the authors don't have particular beliefs about it, but the text doesn't ever mention that, whereas in Paul's text is a consistent, persistent feature of his leadership. Again, being led and leading. And any particular talents, skills, dispositions, habits, practices that you bring to the work, for Paul, would have to be graced upon you in part by God. The other interesting thing that I think the text of the Standard Model sort of misfits Paul is its focus on the self and literally, self-enhancement theory, as it says. It's problematic. It's problematic in part because we just don't see Paul as having the same self as an ancient that we moderns have inherited. And that's, of course, a whole nother conversation, but I don't think that Paul's mission is to self-improve. I don't think Paul would have seen the work as merely an act of self-improvement. There were Greek philosophers, I'm thinking about Epicurus here and others, who had a notion of what it is to live rightly and how to live well and how to live according to a certain kind of virtuous principle, which could perhaps be traced back to self, even though, again, that would be problematic for the ancients. But Paul seems to be pretty God-possessed, pretty involved in the notion that he's doing more than simply making people better on their own terms. Core values for Paul are always situated in the Abrahamic inheritance, and it's contested. He recognizes that, particularly for the movements that he's building with Gentiles, as people try to figure out how much of the Abrahamic to borrow and how much to sort of leave to the side. But still, unlike the text that we read today, including this book, we don't see the Abrahamic inheritance ever explicitly pointed to. We don't see stories of Moses's leadership. We don't get the feeling that there's Christian leaders who themselves have a separate discourse. Jews, Christians, Muslims are all sort of folded into this idea of what it means to be a good leader without any particular allegiances or contexts or what we might call thick descriptions of leadership that would be rooted in their own theology. So again, resisting that idea in these texts. One of the things we have to also acknowledge with Paul that may be a little bit different than some of the softer literature that tries to really create a more inclusive notion of leadership and really points towards, as we said earlier, the idea of communal trust being built by the leader, in part by recognizing the needs of people to express themselves. I think Paul has probably some sympathy at moments, but I would guess those are quiet and unheard. The text makes it clear that Paul in Corinthians can judge, he can direct people, and he can lead the hard cases, including this one case of incest. He's not afraid to act. In fact, he says, I will judge, I have judged. And in that sense, Paul is almost approaching a kind of acting as an intercessor for God, which would again be something that I think we would consider strange, but he does it. And this is compared to the leadership challenge where you have stories and examples of people who sort of complain, I was given responsibility, but I had no authority to hold others accountable. That's a complaint that some employees have made and some leaders working with those employees. And again, Paul has no problem with this. He has authority and he's glad to hold people accountable. Also, in this leadership literature, you hear people sort of concerned about, well, someone else took credit for my hard work and the results, and that seemed unfair to me. And so a good leader would not allow that to occur or would somehow acknowledge and celebrate everybody's hard work and results. There are places in Paul where he flirts with the idea of, on the one hand, taking credit and knowing what he's done. But I think also this idea that he's spending most of his time worrying about that. No, I think we can say that in general, he's giving God the glory, so to speak. But again, it's just a different feeling for Paul's leadership than what we're seeing in the modern discourses. And then here again, the mantra, and this is coming kind of out of the book again, you are what you do when you look inward. That's a direct quote. I think Paul would find that useless, that statement, without God's grace and Christ. So it's very hard to talk about Paul's leadership and decontextualizing and decoupling it from these notions of will, grace, and Christ's being in Christ. Looking inward is perhaps necessary, but it's not sufficient for Paul. And so again, we push back on the idea that we can make Paul fit modern leadership discourse.
Okay, so let's bring this to a conclusion. Uh, and when we use the leadership challenge as a conversation partner, and you can see the book more or less as doing the same thing about leadership than the Walt Disney 2007 motion picture Ratatouille did for cooking. You know, if you've ever seen that animated movie, one thing that you get from the rat who's featured as the star of the movie is that everyone can cook. So he hears the call of cooking, and even if he's a rat, he decides that he can cook. So in the leadership challenge, what you hear is that everyone can be a leader. And that was the audience of the book. All people of goodwill can eventually end up being good leaders. So I quote, we focus on everyday leaders because leadership is not about position or title. It's not about the family you were born into. It's not about being at the organization apex as CEO, president, general, or prime minister. And it's definitely not about being some sort of hero. Leadership is about relationships, about credibility, about passion and conviction, and ultimately about what you do. So this is the perspective of the book. This is, you know, about people who find themselves in a role of leaderships and who want to do a good job. And in that sense, it's a very different stance from what you have in Paul's letters when, well, we took First Corinthians as a place to anchor our research. When you look at Paul's model of leadership in First Corinthians, you get, you know, it speaks at a different level. First, you don't choose to become a leader, you're called to leadership by the God of Israel. You're also, and this is really counterintuitive for nowadays, Paul's leadership is only for a short time, a near horizon. It's no more than for one generation. Think about leaders nowadays who are leading an organization knowing that the organization will cease to exist very soon. Claude, the other week, spoke about the Bloc Québécois, which is a very interesting case in terms of temporary organization, which has become more or less a permanent organization. There would be more to say about such organizations, short-term organizations, but this is what Paul does. He leads only for short term. He's also, at the difference of other leaders with a clear position in the hierarchy of the organization, Paul is basically a leader among leaders who are all on the same level and with associates and co-workers. He's also, you know, he ends up being in a very difficult or, difficult posture, which remains an issue both for himself, for the other leaders, and for the congregants. He's a translocal leader, but yes, yet he has to focus on the needs of this given community, the one in Corinth. He has also to share leadership with others, such as Apollos and Peter, who are translocal leaders, who also have their followers in the Corinthian church. And he also knows what is just enough and what is too much for the community to take in and exchange. There's something also, there was a follow-up letter, 2 Corinthians, which indicate that not all the issues addressed in 1 Corinthians were probably successfully addressed, and new problems came in. What it shows also in First and Second Corinthians is that the relationship between Paul and the church of Corinth, the various house churches, is often bumpy, difficult, and needs to be constantly mended because it's harmed. So we're talking about very two different understanding of what leaders are, what's their position, what's their stake, and what makes them come to leadership position. So yeah.
That is the end of our talk.
Yes. And we can entertain a few questions for and comments for the remaining time. We still have a few minutes.
I think that modeling was a very modern aspect of Paul leadership. He was modeling the new the style of organization that he wanted for the sake of the body of Christ.
Yes.
And they asked that organization asked that from their leaders today.
Yes, but in leadership today, you're trying to build for long term.
The ending of the organization.
Yes, and what Paul does is finally to lead an organization for a short term. That's why I find the Bloc Québécois such a great example, because when it was created, it was for short term.
Yeah.
But it has transformed to become, a very institutionalized.
Yeah,
and,
but
had to rethink about. Had to rethink several times what it was doing exactly, what was the goal of the organization and how it should be organized.
Yeah, but Paul had several years to organize its churches.
Yes.
And new leaders, nowadays leaders, they have mandates that are maybe 3 year long, 5 year long. It's not so long for a leader to be able to transform their organization.
I think that's a good point, particularly if we think about accountability mechanisms, right? In which leaders are embedded in accountability systems today.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the board of directors, maybe it's the stock market and the shareholders, maybe it's simply the venture capitalists who are underwriting the leaders' activities. Could also be the chancellor of a large organization, a university, who's putting pressure on presidents to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Paul does not have those pressures, does he? So he's not dealing in a world of modern organizational forms.
Because his boss was far from him.
Yes.
And on the other hand, he has the pleasure, doesn't he? He has the opportunity to say, my boss is directing me, and I don't think we can debate that. And I'm the person who's here to tell you something. So he doesn't even have to worry about communicating or demonstrating how he's communicating with the boss.
Yeah, and he could use his boss the way he wanted to use it, without having to make explicit or public the relationship that he has with his boss.
Well, he does, and on the other hand, it maybe out of now I'm imposing kind of a potentially a psychoanalytic interpretation, but maybe it's the anxiety of knowing that he has to demonstrate that relationship that puts him to say, I, apostle, right? And to state that first, so that there's no mystery, and then he can assert it without having to defend it. But I also think, in fairness to Paul, that he must have thought that Peter had some insight. Peter knew the boss. Peter actually met the boss. Whereas I always think of Paul as that one generation.
He was hired by the boss.
He was hired by the boss. And so when I think about Peter's authority inside of these early churches, and Jean-François and I have talked about this, it's hard to know because Peter's silent, literally silent for us. I mean, you could say First Peter, but basically he's silent. People must have respected him for having also had wisdom, in part by his proximity to the boss.
Yeah.
And so Paul just does not, I mean, today's CEO is not answering either to the boss or somebody with proximity to the founder.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother world of actors and accountability and stakeholder mechanisms.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're writing your book on St. Paul's and leadership, and you should go ahead with this. And perhaps you're not interested in going any further with your research than that. But I want to point to something that is most interesting and that could open up, if you have students that you can, PhD students whose thesis you could direct to continue the work, is that we tend to do in leadership case studies of different cultures, or even less, but even that isn't that frequent cross-cultural comparison. We tend to compare an organization to another, within the same culture. That's far more frequent. But we do very little longitudinal analysis. That is a comparison with the past and and even less, synchronic comparison in the past. So I would urge you, knowing that this might not be your interested desire, you just want to be done with it. But find somebody else who has that sort of knowledge to do it. Try to see, can we do it on Peter? Can we do it? So within the first leaders or very closely related, and do comparative analysis there. But more so, I want to point out, I think it will be very useful for you, but on the 20th of May, we have Norman Sandridge from Howard University in Washington, D.C., who's going to come to us about the education of Cyrus. And the reason why I think that this is important, first of all, for you, Cyrus is the first Messiah, the Persian emperor who liberated the Jews from the Babylonian exile. So he's the first one to be called a Messiah. And Xenophon wrote a treatise of the education of leaders based on this Persian king and his education. So it would be interesting to see what he understands. I know nothing about Xenophon's work, and so I will discover this with everybody else. But it would be interesting to start doing comparison, and I can see a great usefulness for leadership study. I was exchanging with some of you in private here about things it makes us think about, and there's so that I find of great use, and I think that you will find even greater use if you multiply the point of comparison, so yeah.
As a manager, sorry, Anne-Laure, go ahead.
I just have to leave, so I just wish you a very nice afternoon, and I thank you very much, Brent and Jean-François, because those two ideas, to be called for leading and this idea of discerning the body in relation to the word, are rich for me. So I take them, think about them, and
wonderful, Anne. Thank you.
Yeah,
so great to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you also for the questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, but I think you're on really interesting. And that was one I was discussing with if you remember our conversation with James Maroussis earlier on, and he used the Chrétien de Troyes story about the story of the Grail, and a very important question in that story to understand. In fact, the whole story turns around that, and who served the Grail? The Fisher King thinks one thing, and is wrong, and the fact of asking this question and heals the Fisher King. And who of whom are we the apostles today? Who do we serve? And a Grail, and not necessarily a boss, is something important. The whole idea of the narcissistic calling, as opposed to a more this mystical relationship to zeitgeist. I find something about the zeitgeist that I find interesting, and I always quote it because of who wrote it. Demet, you may know this philosopher, this Oxford philosopher, analytical philosopher, so absolutely not prone to mysticism, wrote a history of analytical philosophy. And he starts in his introduction, he starts his history by noticing that the ideas of creating analytical philosophy popped up in England, in Germany, in Poland at about the same time to people who were not related. And he has this sentence, which I think is what the body of Christ could, an aspect of what the body of Christ would have meant for Paul. He said, it's as if the idea of creating an analytical philosophy was up in the air and some people seized it. So he gives the most impressive argument for the objective reality of ideas, of universals, that they are somehow out there, that it's as if the work of man by the discussion and so on has create leftovers that are not picked up by anybody, but that create something in the air. And some people have antennas and they picked up those ideas, and this is how this analytical philosopher explains how analytical philosophy could have started in England and Poland and in Vienna and at about the same time with people who didn't know each other, and then realized very quickly that they were doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, isn't that always like this when you have what you think a groundbreaking idea and you submit a proposal to give a paper at a conference and it's accepted, and you look at the program and several other people are presenting on the same groundbreaking idea.
Yeah.
And this is where you realize indeed there was something going on in terms of discussions that finally materializes into propositions about this question.
Val, did you want to say something?
Thank you. It was a great seminar.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
So next week is Eliane Bézard, as I said, for a week. Then we have Claude for 3 weeks with a gentleman I don't know, Marc Junot, who worked with Claude. And then we enter into various people who have agreed to submit to the special issue of Science et Esprit on leadership. So there will be a series of 1 week event, and that's the context in which Norman Sandridge is going to talk. So when I'll send I will send you the MP4 of today. I will send you the chat because there were a number of things that were said in the chat that could be useful for all. And I will also send you the Excel of the conferences to come. So you know, we're going to keep at 9 because we're used to it now. But it's
okay.
So you know, the idea was to make it less awful for Jean-François and Brent, but also Marina, who never showed up. But Marina was 2 hours behind because of the change of time. But Mexico is changing its time zone today. It's going to summertime today. So we might see her again. But that's the joy of. That's the joy of being in different time zone. I know that Isabelle Loss is sending her best. She's watching everything you said. You didn't have a chance to speak with her because she's caught with other meetings. But she does watch you and she finds what you're doing very interesting. And there were 2 women who were there earlier. Who said that they were really interested by your topic, but they cannot follow. They don't know English enough to follow, and they actually do follow you in film version because they can stop and look for words. So that's also another situation.
Thank you for that feedback, Arnaud. I appreciate it a lot, and also your support for this. When we do today's talk, is there a way for you to edit out the break and edit out any?
The only one who knows to do this knows I know him, and I don't want to impose any more.
Okay, I can actually do it too. I'll splice it myself. Okay, so good. Just wanted to know. You're just going to send it to us. Thank you for sending it. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Yes. Much appreciated indeed.
You stay in. Qu'on se parle. Peux-tu rester, Claude, qu'on se parle?
Ouais.
Ouais. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.